Hi, this is Sean Wepner, Chief Strategy Officer at Nisos. We're getting things started up here, but we're going to wait a couple more minutes to let some people hop on, but just want to let you know we're going to get started shortly. All right, we're going to get started here. As I said earlier, my name is Sean Wepner. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Nisos. A little bit about my background. I spent about a decade in the defense and intelligence community as a data scientist and software engineer. And I'm excited for you all to join here on our discussion around disinformation and the impacts on the private sector and how you can help protect your brand. So Nisos, just brief introduction. We are a company that provides services to help simulate and investigate threats, both in terms of cyber and more broadly in situations such as disinformation campaigns. With me today, I have two of our key experts from our investigations team here for the discussion. We have Cindy Otis and Ryan Bloom. And Cindy and Ryan, if you could both, in that order, give me a little bit of a background on what your past careers looked like, what you do here, and we'll move on from there. So Cindy and then Ryan.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I spent a decade as well in the intelligence community. I was an intelligence analyst, a briefer, and then also a manager, primarily working on Europe and the Middle East security issues. I am on the threat and investigations team, as Sean mentioned, and I work primarily disinformation analysis, and then I'm also the author of a forthcoming book on the subject as well.
Hi, and this is Ryan Bloom. I'm also on the threat and investigations team with Cindy. Prior to my joining Nisos about more than a year ago, I was in the intelligence community as well for also similarly a decade as well, focused primarily on counterterrorism in the Middle East and South Asia, as well as open source collection and analysis.
Awesome. Well, I'll kick things off here, and we have some slides just as reference to help drive the discussion. But first, I thought it would be good to start with discussing some of the key elements of disinformation. Cindy, maybe you could kick things off here.
Sure thing. Happy to. So just by way of background, a couple of broad overarching points on disinformation, just so we're all on the same page. So there are a couple of different terms related to disinformation that often can get confused. There's disinformation and then there's misinformation. And so the way that we're talking about disinformation is false information that is shared with an actor knowing that it is false. The intention is to use that false information to manipulate. So misinformation then is false information in which the actor sharing it doesn't necessarily know that it's false. So a couple of key elements of disinformation, how it works, and what it's trying to do essentially. So disinformation often makes an emotional appeal. It targets divisive or what can be divisive topics, such as race or gender or religion. And the intent with that is to, because emotions are so powerful, really, it sort of triggers an automatic reaction from us. It also can overpower sort of logic and reason that we might use to apply to a particular message we're seeing that might make us otherwise stop and think, okay, is this really true or not? So the emotional appeal sort of overrides our logic and our critical thinking. So the two most powerful emotions probably will come as no surprise. Those are anger and fear. And then the second sort of piece is that sometimes disinformation will contain seeds of truth. So it's not necessarily a entirely false statement or false content. It can be true things that have been manipulated. And the goal for most actors in that case is to create content that sounds vaguely familiar to the person consuming the content. And so the person thinks, maybe they've heard it somewhere before and therefore it might be true. And then the third key element for disinformation campaigns is that repetition is really key. So repeating the same narrative over and over and over again, even if it's slightly modified each time it's repeated, that repetition ends up making the thing or the narrative look like fact, because again, the consumer of that content thinks, hey, I've heard this somewhere before, so it must be true. So those are kind of the key elements of disinformation that I hope will be helpful in our discussion to keep in mind.
Something that kind of resonates with me is, growing up, I loved reading Michael Crichton books, and something that clearly, obviously fiction, but the stories that he wrote integrated a lot of elements of truth in terms of research and cited a lot of the research as a part of the book to build that narrative and really pull you into the story. And it seems like that's something that's very much used here, at least in those latter cases, to pull people into that narrative and really sell the picture of what's going on as truth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a common tactic because it works so well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As we've seen in a lot of the more successful disinformation campaigns recently, as Cindy said, those three key components: emotional appeal, containing seeds of truth, and the repetition of narratives. Some of the most successful campaigns, like the Internet Research Agency, based out of Russia, for example, had those three key components in a lot of the memes and content that they put out to spread disinformation and affect their audiences.
And I can imagine the repetition of narratives too that follows various formats. So it won't necessarily be the repetition of a narrative specifically through just Twitter or just, another type of social network or medium. It follows that narrative across many. Would you say that's right?
Yeah. Frequently actors will use multiple platforms to spread their narratives, whether it's on Twitter, Reddit, Facebook. Really, they look for anywhere where their target audience will, be receptive, be engaged, and amplify their content.
So you'd say it follows kind of a flow.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
So, to kind of follow that narrative, Cindy, why don't you talk a little bit about the overall flow of disinformation and how those types of campaigns are orchestrated?
Sure. So part of our work at Nisos is on the disinformation front is to really track disinformation campaigns from start to finish. And so understanding the life cycle of a campaign is very, very important. So if we look at how disinformation campaigns usually start, and this is applicable to not just foreign government actors, but to domestic actors, actors that are concerned about, that are motivated by profit and things like that. This sort of chart that we've put up here for you is very applicable to all of those actors. So it starts at the planning stages. The threat actor plans a campaign, looks at what kind of narratives would be most effective in their calculation to influence a particular audience. So at that stage, they're doing a lot of analysis and figuring out how they're going to deploy that campaign. And then the second stage is that deployment. So the threat actor primarily uses social media, websites, encrypted messaging apps to spread information like WhatsApp. And their goal in deploying it is to reach their intended targets. And that might be influencers, for example. So a lot of campaigns, in their minds, the goal really is to get a piece of false content onto the radar of people that they would consider influencers. That might be a journalist or a public figure of some kind, accounts with significant numbers of followers and things like that. So that's where we roll into stage number 3, which is that human engagement. So it's really that real human user that threat actor is counting on, hoping that if they can get the right kind of false content in front of real humans that respond to it in a way, that those humans will spread the content for them. So they're hoping to get shares from the real human accounts, likes and comments. And then again, as I said, influencers are really key at that stage because they can help spread content faster than, a fake sock puppet account, for example, can on its own. And then the fourth stage is that sharing stage. So as human actors push out a particular stream of disinformation because they were sort of fooled by it, the disinformation ends up going through different streams, right? So it gets picked up by potentially conspiracy theorists, groups that are politically motivated, maybe foreign governments even. One of the things that we're seeing is, it's not just foreign government actors that are delving into the disinformation space, it's also domestic actors, and that leaves the foreign governments that are interested in pushing these campaigns in a position where all they have to do really is spread the content that domestic actors are already generating. So as the disinformation spreads, the narrative starts to shift, and that's number 5. And so we'll see particular narratives start to evolve and change as different groups, for different motivations, like I talked about earlier, sort of manipulate or adapt that narrative to fit what they're trying to do with that information. And then it goes back to the beginning.
And with this, the flow that Cindy just described, I think with each of these levels, it particularly provides, each provides also an opportunity to get attribution on the actors involved. As Cindy was mentioning, some of the disinformation campaigns that we've seen targeting both the public and private sectors, they'll use, as you were saying, encrypted messaging apps or dark web forums to communicate, and because of our access and tool sets, we're able to collect and work to attribute the actors, as well as in the other stages of looking, who are the humans engaging, who are the influencers, who's sharing it, and who then is capitalizing on the changes in the narratives, the shifts in the narrative. And then again, it continues on, just as Cindy was saying.
So would you and Cindy say that, is this generally a fairly long process? Are each parts of these generally a certain, time frame? Like, how does this play out in an overall orchestrated effort? And obviously, I guess that would change depending on the size and scale of the disinformation campaign. But, is this something that takes weeks? Is this something that can take, a very short period of time or a long period of time? And Cindy, what do you think?
Yeah, so you're right on in saying it sort of depends on the case. Different actors have a different level of sophistication that they employ. So that's everything from the quality of the content that they create to different steps that they might put in place to distance themselves or limit their particular fingerprints around certain campaigns. So for example, we'll see groups or individuals or foreign governments that hire companies that provide disinformation-like services, or individuals that provide disinformation-like services as a way of distancing themselves from a particular campaign and obscuring sort of really who's behind it. So it really can depend. Certainly, there are certain nation-state actors that are much better at operational security and employing practices to obscure their identity, or put in place sort of misattributable information. So what we're hoping for, and we can talk about it a bit later on, of course, when we are talking a bit more about attribution, is what we're hoping for is that somewhere along the way that they're going to screw up. And if they screw up, we hope to find that little nugget that they've left somewhere along the path, and that certainly helps our work.
Absolutely. So shifting the conversation a little bit further ahead, talking about tactics that these threat actors use. Maybe it's a good time to start to dig into kind of those things as they lay across the overall flow of a disinformation campaign. Cindy?
Sure. Yep. So we're seeing a lot of different tactics being employed, and as threat actors get more and more experienced, those tactics are certainly evolving on a daily basis. But some of the ones that we're currently seeing, so we're seeing fake accounts being created that are no longer automated the way that we traditionally think of, bot accounts are automated. So they're more blended accounts in which a real human user is running multiple fake accounts at the same time. They're posting original content rather than, copying and pasting or automatically populating the same content across accounts. And that's because, platforms are able to quickly identify that kind of activity. They're also diversifying the platforms that they're targeting. So, they're not just going after the couple of large social media platforms. They're also going after, or leveraging rather, blog websites, WordPress websites, encrypted messaging apps like we talked about before, et cetera. And so that rise of encrypted messaging apps is a tactic. It's where they're disseminating a lot of false content because it is very easy to do so and not have it tracked back to the individual pushing out the content. It can spread very rapidly. We've seen lots of cases all over the world of rumors about, individuals, public figures, companies, et cetera, spreading like wildfire through encrypted messaging apps. And it's very hard to track back then who originally created that content. And then we're also seeing gamification of disinformation activities as well, which is groups or individuals building software applications in which users, join the application, download the application, and then they receive incentives for posting certain content, right? So, post these 5 messages today, and you get so many coins or whatever, and that raises your status in the gamified app. And then we're also seeing, of course, the pairing of disinformation attacks with cyber attacks as well. So using spear phishing to gain access to sensitive information that then gets deployed online. And then, as I mentioned earlier, with the rise of the disinformation industry, so that's governments, individuals, companies, groups, et cetera, hiring disinformation, commercial disinformation services. And those come in the form of things like black PR companies that call themselves digital marketing firms, and dark web crime groups as well to conduct the disinformation for them. And then even as these current tactics evolve and get more sophisticated, we certainly don't discount the very big impact that the old tactics still have to this day, which is mostly things that anyone with a computer or smartphone can produce, which is things like memes, where false text or manipulated text is paired with a graphic, even a real image, edited videos that anyone can make these days, thanks to developments in software, and then fake websites as well. Those still have a lot of traction these days with disinformation campaigns.
Now, both you and Ryan have touched on the fact that this touches both the public and the private sector. And I think, that connection in terms of how these tactics and these tools and platforms and the actors that use them to engage in disinformation campaigns have shifted and have been using these against the private sector. Cindy, how does that transition play out outside of politics?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. So the focus on disinformation is often, government disinformation, foreign governments conducting information warfare, essentially. But we should also remember that as an example, the Russian Internet Research Agency, not only were they promoting divisive political content, the fake accounts that they were creating also targeted companies as well. And one example is they tried to generate a conspiracy theory saying that a certain company that sells produce and things like that, the week before Thanksgiving, they claimed, these IRA accounts claimed that that company's chicken, or turkeys rather, were infected purposely with salmonella. And they produced a pretty sophisticated and coordinated campaign in trying to push that message. And if you're that company the week before Thanksgiving, that seriously affects your bottom line, your financial bottom line. So there is a lot of overlap. But in the commercial disinformation space, you have foreign governments that are looking to leverage negative criticism about companies. And then you also have individuals, groups, and other companies that are interested in using these sorts of tactics against a potential competitor. And we're seeing disinformation evolve, and frankly, marketing practices evolving in a way that sounds an awful lot like disinformation in some cases. And so we've seen instances in which individuals or companies have hired commercial services, again, going back to those companies that call themselves PR firms or marketing firms, but really those companies actually provide disinformation services. And then using those individuals, those experts in disinformation campaigns to target other companies, public figures, and that sort of thing, essentially targets for whom they want to destroy their credibility, either for financial gain or for other ideological reasons. So there's an interesting evolution happening there.
It sounds like it's kind of taking a note from more nation-state driven economic warfare and transitioning those tactics into the commercial sector. Would you say that's about right?
Yeah, there's sort of been two tracks happening, I think, at the same time. So something like, hiring individuals to create fake accounts to promote certain content or products, that's been happening, ever since the internet was created. And we see groups and individuals out of, Southeast Asia and countries like Indonesia, India, places like that, where they've been providing those kinds of services for decades at this point. And then on the other hand, you have companies that are popping up, more inspired these days by the tactics used by foreign governments to provide those services as well. So there's sort of been these two different tracks, but they're merging at this point.
Yeah, and I would contribute to that as well by saying we've seen a lot with short and distort campaigns where an actor, whether it's an individual or a group, will use various tactics that are similar to what we see with nation-state actors in the disinformation space, as well as other non-governmental groups, where they're using similar tactics of using fake accounts or sock puppets to put out content and have their associates and others amplify that content, and also similarly use domains that are quickly set up, that are set up to look to be professional outlets or polished designs to then spread inauthentic content about a company in order for an individual with a short position in the financial market to then take advantage of that by spreading misinformation, causing harm to the company's reputation so that they're benefiting with financial gain.
So with all this stuff going on, a big part of what we do is attribute these types of threats. And talking about attribution, and I think part of that is being able to spot inauthentic content here, but maybe we can touch on how to spot inauthentic content, but then also more broadly, how do we attribute this type of activity? And I'd also like to take a moment to remind people that if you have any questions, please submit them to the platform. and let us know what's coming to mind. But getting back to how do we attribute this type of activity?
Yeah, I can start off with talking about a few ways to spot inauthentic activity. For example, if you're seeing on Twitter or another social media platform that a certain hashtag critical of your company is spreading and going viral, you can take a look using a variety of tools that are open source and on the internet, like Twitonomy or Social Bearing, and see some cues for spotting inauthentic activity. And those would be, you take a look at the account that might be spreading that hashtag, and you might find that they're having minimal organic personal content. It's all single issue, devoted to, say, criticizing the company, or is spamming a certain type of content or news articles from a domain. There's never really any, or most often there is not, with these kind of unsophisticated actors that might be doing this, a lot of personal content where they're talking about their life, their family, their kids. It's very single issue. Other inauthentic signatures would be that they are primarily retweeting or reposting comments from others. There, again, is not a lot of self-generated content. They're usually, it's not very organic. And then when you take a look at a profile itself, you might be able to determine that the profile pictures are not unique and that are in fact stolen by using simple reverse image searching capabilities on social or on search engines like Google, Bing, Yandex. By simply putting in the image from a profile, those search engine providers with reverse image searches will flag where these pictures are seen. So, for example, we have on the slide a picture of this guy, Brandon Sexton. If we took this and then put it into Yandex or Google, we would see that his photo is showing up on a variety of foreign dating sites and other spam networks, clearly showing to us that this is not a unique person. It's not unique to this account. Also, with this profile, for example, it's a good signature. We'll see randomly generated usernames or that have that don't match up with the handle and the username. So, for example, here we have Brandon Sexton, but then below it has at Peter Rowe. So clearly there's a difference between these two, which is usually a signature that the account might be stolen, bought off the dark web, or might have been hacked into and then modified by the actor behind the campaign. Also, we'll see these accounts post in multiple languages, and when a foreign actor might be behind a disinformation campaign, we'll see that a lot of their, or some of their content might be kind of awkward in its construction. It would signify that the actors are not a native speaker to the language in question for the company involved. For example, in several cases when we're looking at the Internet Research Agency's disinformation campaigns, obviously those are Russian speakers behind those accounts, and when they were crafting English language memes and content blocks, it read very awkwardly and was provided opportunities for people to kind of hone in and attribute that the people behind these accounts were not legitimate people. They were in fact sock puppets or false personas.
So we've talked a little bit about the element of attribution that's specific to spotting inauthentic behavior. Cindy, can you start to dig into some of the other elements of attribution?
Yeah, sure. So some of the other elements besides looking at inauthentic accounts, and to be clear, there are different levels of sophistication on that front. So the example that we have on the screen is sort of on the lower end of sophistication, whereas a more sophisticated actor would be a bit harder to identify. But we look at things like their online network infrastructure, where websites are hosted, servers, what servers they're using. We also look at, and it's something we alluded to earlier, about posting on multiple platforms. So a lot of threat actors, they're just trying to get as much content out there as possible so that the real human user will engage, right? And so we'll often see very similar messages being pushed across multiple social media platforms and websites. And some of that will occur sometimes on, at the same time frame. So they might not post the same exact message instantaneously on multiple forums or websites or social media platforms, but there's enough coordination happening around certain times that it can be a bit easier for us to identify the narratives and then start to peel back who might be involved in pushing those narratives. We spend a lot of time focusing on researching the various threat actors, whether it's foreign governments or it's commercial enterprises, and learning their tactics and their tools and how they're evolving their strategies, because there isn't always a smoking gun. You hope that there is. You hope that, they've screwed up somewhere down the road, and if you peel back enough information that you'll be able to find that, like I said. But often it comes down to knowing the threat actor and knowing the strategies and tactics and tools that they use, so that you can look for patterns that match that, or activity that matches what the threat actor, what their strategy is. So there's a lot of that behind it as well.
Now, Ryan kind of touched on this a little bit in terms of some of the tools that we use, rather. Cindy, what are some other tools across different elements of it outside of the inauthentic behavior element that you use? Are they traditionally open source? Are there some that aren't even available on the internet? Are they paid? Do you and do our team, do we make a lot of technology around this? I mean, obviously I don't know the answer to that last part, but share a little bit about the suite of tools that kind of are used across that spectrum.
Yeah, so we use absolutely everything we can get our hands on. I wish that there was one tool to rule them all, where you could plug something in and automatically find exactly what you're looking for. That's not the case. So we use a range of tools to do different things. Open source tools, like Ryan mentioned some of them. A lot of really good research is being done, and app development in non-governmental organizations. So we use those. We develop a lot of our own, though. We work very hard to develop the correct tools to match the tactics and strategies that we know those threat actors are employing. I think oftentimes it can, folks who are engaged in this space end up being a bit behind the curveball, because they try to solve the disinformation problem of 2015 or 2016, but threat actors are already have moved beyond that space. And so we at Nisos work very hard to develop tools for not just yesterday, but for tomorrow as well, based on our knowledge of the threat actor and how that's developing. And then a lot of our work is driven, and a lot of what we leverage is data, and through various things to which we have access to via Nisos. And then, of course, we have a range of paid subscription tools as well.
What's the biggest barrier to entry for a company that's looking to start to get a handle on some of the activity that they're seeing? Where do they start? And how do you start to think about, building an awareness of and start to get a handle on this type of activity?
That's a great question. So oftentimes the first barrier in a company to addressing disinformation is actually thinking about it as disinformation. There's a tendency to think of potentially, negative content that might be coming out about a company online as, a branding issue or a marketing issue. We might think, well, it's just, one person's opinion, but more and more we peel back those cases, and it's actually something a lot more coordinated, sophisticated, and coming from an actor that the company was not suspecting. And so the first challenge is really, having that tough conversation as a company in which, you can help your coworkers understand that this isn't, one person's opinion. We're actually talking about an actual disinformation campaign. So that's sort of the first barrier. And then the second is really getting a handle on who are the actors, and being prepared for those actors to know sort of how is your company at risk and how best to defend against those risks. So that starts with engaging subject matter experts in this space to help you as a company identify what are our vulnerabilities, what are the narratives that are out there, who are the actors that are potentially launching these campaigns or might launch these campaigns, and then how do you as a company prepare from top to bottom to respond and defend against those campaigns. So that's things like, do you have a comms strategy in place? Have you had a discussion as a company about, what is sort of the line that needs to be crossed before you as a company decide to speak publicly about a disinformation campaign you might be seeing. But a lot of that all comes down to making sure you know the facts about who is doing the campaign, what their motivations and intentions are, what their network and what their capability is. And that is the only way, really, having that holistic understanding of a campaign, that a company can really truly prepare and defend against disinformation campaigns.
That's great. All right, awesome. Well, that concludes our webinar on disinformation. Really appreciate everybody taking their time to join us. And again, thank you first and foremost to Cindy Otis and Ryan Bloom for joining. I want to remind everybody that we have in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel our Cindy's recent paper on disinformation fake news that we covered. And please visit Nisos.com, learn a little bit more about what we're doing, and feel free to reach out with any questions that you have on how you can help your brand, help your company protect its value against these types of attacks. So thank you very much and have a great week.